and we're going to move right into the workshop. I will give the superintendent an opportunity to move into the workshop presentation.
Yep. And we may actually need to take a break. We can do the procurement policy and the procurement policy and the board conflict of interest policy, because I'm covering those. But then Assistant Superintendent Townsend is finishing up the Lincoln Shared Space Cafe, and is expected to be back at around 7. So
well, let's start then. We're going to start our workshop to review the first read policies, and let's start with the purchasing and board conflict of interest policies, and then we can see if we need to take a break or not. So, Mr. Superintendent, take it away.
Yeah, so the first policy that is on the agenda that you will be asked to vote on at the next meeting is Board Policy DJ. This is our purchasing policy. It governs how Portland Public Schools goes about procuring goods and services. By and large, the policy as it currently exists incorporates the city's purchasing ordinance, except where there's statutory requirements that override this ordinance. This summer, our legal counsel advised that the district needed to update this policy to incorporate the Federal Unified Grant Guidance, the UGG. I love that they tried to give it a cute name because it's anything but that. That governs procurement using federal funds. This guidance was implemented in August. It was implemented by my issuing a memo to our CFO, directing them to make the guidance what we would use and publicize that for staff who are in procurement. And so the revisions to the actual policy that you're going to be asked to vote on reflect this requirement and the adoption. So in your packet, you have the policy as it currently exists. You have the policy as, in red line with the Drummond Woodson edits, and you can see that those are, entirely just about the incorporation of the Federal Unified Grant Guidance. And then we are also advancing the code. I'm sorry, we're also advancing the regulations, the regulations, the ARB, which the board is not voting on. Those are, advanced by administration, but, we do share them with you, and you can see, in essence, that it's the same thing. It's just specifying the incorporation of the federal guidance. There is also in the packet the actual procurement manual implementation email and the actual manual for distribution. So those are also included in your packet along with the board memo. So that's the procurement policy. And so I'll pause to see if you have any questions or comments, concerns.
Any questions on the procurement policy changes? I don't see any, Mr. Superintendent. I think we can move on.
Okay. The second one is, related. So as we were looking to revise that policy, our attorneys also advised that we needed to update board policy BCB, which is the board members' conflict of interest policy. Again, all it does is it incorporates into the existing policy a clause that reflects the new federal procurement requirements and basically requires that board members that are involved in procurement using federal funds follow the Unified Grant Guidance So again, in the packet is both the current policy, the red line, and that one also updates references as needed. So these policies were reviewed by the board's policy and curriculum committee back at the October 25th meeting, and they're up for a first read at this meeting and should be up for your consideration and action at our next meeting on November 15th.
All right. Any questions on this? I don't see any. So should we take a brief recess?
Aaron just texted and said that he's on his way. So
Okay.
he'll be here shortly.
Great. So we're going to take a brief recess while we await for Assistant Superintendent Townsend to join us and to walk through the rest of the workshop. Okay, and we are back from our short recess, and we are going to resume our workshop on our first read policies with Assistant Superintendent Townsend, who has just joined us and getting set up. So Assistant Superintendent Townsend, when you are ready.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Nice to be with you again this evening. So we'll begin, I believe, with policy JIH, the questioning and searches of students policy. And, we've attached the related procedure around that. So first, just again, in terms of context, this was a policy that we reviewed with the policy committee during the 2020-2021 school year when we reviewed about 11 board policies, I believe, that, involved law enforcement at some level. Some more than others. Through that process, again, just for folks who weren't with us at that time, we established, as we began that work, we actually established a new policy called KLGB, which is law enforcement involvement in student matters, as kind of a foundational policy to help govern and organize how we approach the revisions to the other existing policies so that we had kind of a framework for that. And just for folks who aren't familiar with that really established kind of 3 tiers, if you will. One, in terms of law enforcement involvement, if there's immediate physical safety, right, we want to be able to and empower staff to access, law enforcement support to be able to protect students and staff. Second, where there are potential violations of law or other serious kind of misconduct that requires consultation with the superintendent's office before engaging law enforcement. And then the third, it outlined a number of kind of behaviors that are solely, the discretion of the school district and school department to be able to manage and address. And the policy set out in broad terms that discipline is the sole, the school district has kind of sole responsibility for discipline. So anyway, that, connects to this policy in our proposed revisions in this because of, some of the proposed changes. So, I'll take responsibility. This policy was reviewed by the policy committee in October of 2021. And it was again at that time we had a number of policies coming up around transportation and so forth that kind of got jumped the line because of operational needs at the time. So it was like recently we passed JICH, the student drug and alcohol use one. So similarly, as we've been ensuring policy books updated, we realized we needed to bring this to the full board. So we are here. So in addition, just a brief word about the changes that are in the proposed policy and the related procedure. One is just, you'll notice the kind of nomenclature updates, the referrals to the Board of Education as opposed to school committee, those kinds of things. So consistent with how we approach all our revisions. The other major there are 2 other major adjustments. One that shows up in multiple places in both the policy and throughout, which is to align the language of in the process of kind of questioning or a search, if there's something that might potentially need to be related to law enforcement, that there's requires consultation again with the superintendent's office for that and hold discretion at the superintendent level about that referral. So again, aligning it to kind of what we'd outlined in policy KLGB. So that shows up in multiple places. And in fact, the language, tried to make the language consistent in terms of kind of that being repeated throughout. So that's a major one. And, and it calls out places where there isn't discretion. Specifically, firearms is one of the often ones. There's federal laws that require us to engage with law enforcement if there are any firearms issues that result from questioning searches or in other contexts in schools. The second major kind of substantive change is more of to help with kind of clarity and transparency. And this is not in the policy, but is in the procedure, in which in the section about searches, we work to revise the language in its section C3 to more clearly articulate kind of how progressively intrusive, I'll say, and obviously it stops short of being fully intrusive, but to be able to maximize the opportunity for students to, kind of come forward, open a backpack, right? And so it more clearly articulates kind of the process we would go through in conducting a search to ensure that, we're doing the least amount of kind of searching essentially as possible and offering students the opportunities. But if there's reasonable suspicion, that it provides administrators the authority to move forward to a point, obviously outlined here in terms of ultimately how far we would go. But that was the other major. So that substantively, that wasn't a big change. It was just in reflection, the language wasn't particularly clear. So we worked on that language revision to be able to clarify that. So those are the major changes as it relates to policy JIH and its related procedure JIHR. I'll pause here for questions. I think we'll do each one, take questions on each one.
Thank you so much, Mr. Townsend. Are there questions from the board? I do myself remember this policy quite well. We spent, as you said, a lot of time on it with the tranche of other related policies. Okay, I don't see any questions from the board, so I think we can move on.
Great. Okay. Let me call up the next one. So the next one in our list is the family medical leave amendments. Want to recognize, what we were trying to do, which was incorporate language out of recent Maine state legislation that extends FMLA coverage to hourly employees. So we had adopted at the policy committee language that was provided to us by the Maine State Management or Maine School Management Association and our partners at Drummond Woodsum in terms of the model policy. So the actual proposed language is not very is significant. It's not very extensive. It just adds a clause under employee eligibility to indicate that threshold. So we're trying to come into compliance with that recent legislation. I want to acknowledge Member Bryden's questions in relationship to the interpretation of that language. So we've reached out, she provided those questions in advance. And so we've reached out to Drummond for guidance and counsel on that and have yet to get resolution on that. So we are working on clarifying the interpretation of that. And, Member Bryden, I'd invite you to, share kind of the gist of the question, maybe, in terms of what you are bringing forward.
Sure. Thank you. And also thank you for passing those questions along. I appreciate that. So just for context, this is what I do for work, like professionally. So I've been doing leave of absence compliance work for 13 years. So I saw this and I thought, oh, goodness. So anyway, the way I'm reading the amendment to the statute, I'm not sure that it accomplishes what it was intended to accomplish. So for example, Assistant Superintendent Townsend, you were referring to hourly employees. I don't think the statute actually specifies hourly employees. I think what it does is it takes Maine FMLA and it breaks it into basically, it does two. The result is that there are two things. So if you don't work for a school and you have worked for your employer for 12 consecutive months, then you get 10 weeks of leave in a 24-month period for a certain set of reasons. Excuse me. But if you work for a school and you have worked for at least 900 hours in the previous 12 months, then you get 12 weeks of leave in a 12-month period for a slightly different set of reasons. So again, I appreciate you bringing this forward so that we can get some clarity on that and make sure that the policy and then what the district is actually doing in terms of granting people leave is, in line with what the law says we have to do. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. So we'll continue to work to resolve those questions and get that clarity from, specifically, that are being raised, from the intent of the legislation. Our goal is, to be able to maximize our employees' access, as governed by kind of state legislation. So we'll continue to work on that. And if that brings forward potential changes to this language, right, we'll certainly update and reflect those before we bring forward for a second read. But
Excellent. Are there any other questions? Okay, and just want to thank Board Member Bryden for bringing this to our attention and enabling us to further investigate and get it right. So thank you, Board Member Bryden. Okay, and we can move on to the last one.
Great. So the last one is what we're bringing forward is proposing for the adoption of workplace bullying. Excuse me. Sorry. Let me get my mind. Workplace bullying policy. So in, I guess in 2021, by legislation, there was, kind of policy and expectation around the adoption of a workplace bullying policy. It's now a required policy. We had intended in following the Educator of Color report to convene during last year a work group to look at the staff harassment and sexual harassment policy. So that's policy ACAB, somewhat in the vein of how we had engaged a work group around the revision of the student harassment policy. As folks I know are familiar, there are various operational, just challenges that made it really hard to pull people together, initiate that work in the way that we'd intended over the course of last spring. So our intent had been to be able to kind of look at those simultaneously so that, if there were areas of revision that we thought wanted to go further or that they were in concert, that we would be able to look at them kind of in, together. And so, but we, we're not able to advance the work around ACAB, the harassment and sexual harassment of employees policy. That's work we're still committed to. I've had initial conversations with the chair of the Policy and Curriculum Committee about that as for our work plan. Similarly with Barrett Wilkinson, our Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging. So that's a body of work we're committed to advancing. And so our proposal for the board's consideration is, given that it was an expectation to have adopted the workplace bullying policy in October of last year, that we to kind of get in compliance and have those protections available, at least at kind of the model policy language, that we move forward adopting this for now, so that we have it on the books, right? Employees can avail themselves of it as needed. And then, our commitment in our work plan for the coming spring is to kind of do the work that we've been intending to do, which is gathering folks, take a deep dive on ACAB and potential revisions there from a kind of trauma-informed lens, and kind of racial equity lens that we took to the ACAA revisions. And as well as we do that, consider if that implicates any potential additional changes, amendments, to the existing just kind of model policy language from our partners, MSMA and Drummond for that. So that's what we're proposing in terms of this. So the language is not, ours, but came from those sources. And yeah. So.
Excellent. Are there questions on this? I have one question. So Mr. Townsend, what we're saying is that we'd have these two different policies that would be complementary, that we'd have the discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, as well as the bullying, and they would be two separate policies, and referenced, of course, within the individual policies, but they would stand alone.
Yep. Which is similar to what exists, at the student level, right? So the harassment, those are, based on protected classes, and we have the bullying general, right? So it's a similar construct.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. Okay. Don't see any questions on this. So I think we're good. And that concludes our workshop. end our meeting at 7:17 p.m. So thank you, Mr. Townsend, and thank
course.
you to everyone who was here tonight for your good work. And I hope you enjoy this time that you might not have anticipated. Good night, everyone.
Night.